When I ask people what they love about living in Texas, a familiar set of responses usually emerges, chiefly small government and low taxes. And while an equitable tax structure and an unobtrusive government which promotes the rights and liberty of its constituents are certainly ideals to be pursued, when put under scrutiny, it becomes difficult to substantiate the claim that Texas holds dear either of these principles. In reality, these phrases are largely employed in incredibly inconsistent, perverse, and misleading manners hiding behind fragments of truth. Texas's image as some sort of low-tax haven due to a lack of income tax is completely negated by having disproportionately large sales and excise taxes, brutally suppressing the economic mobility of the state's working class. Likewise, Texas is always the first to decry federal overreach in issues where the state's opinion lies in contrast to the federal consensus, but in their own borders, Texas acts exactly like the tyrannical, faraway federal government that they denounce so often, by constantly interfering in local affairs. The unfortunate truth is that, in the laundry list of things to appreciate about Texas, low taxes and small government should most certainly be removed, because unlike the state's barbecue, Tex-Mex, or beautifully varied scenery, these two ideals are not backed up by the truth. Let's start with taxes and regulations. Well, yes, I will admit it is true that if you are Joe Rogan fleeing California's progressive taxes, or Elon Musk evading California's pesky labor protections, you are certainly paying less and directly benefiting from a lack of regulation. However, for the vast majority of us who are not named Joe Rogan or Elon Musk, you are likely being harmed, not helped, by this lack of oversight. See, America in general has a pretty regressive, effective tax rate. According to the Brookings Institute, America's tax system is less effective at reducing income inequality than most comparable OECD nations, including Germany, Australia, Canada, and the UK. In America, according to the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, the bottom 20% of income earners pay about 50% more in effective tax rate than the top 1%. Some states are slightly better in this regard and some worse. Put simply, Texas and other states dominated by corporate interests are universally among the worst. It is true that Texas has no income tax. However, the state has to get its revenue somehow, and when states, like Texas, are heavily dependent on sales and excise taxes to make up the gap for a lower income tax, that bill falls largely on the state's working class. This has resulted in the second least equitable tax structure in the entire union. Check out the bar graph detailing the effective tax rate in Texas segmented by income percentile. The effective tax rate on the bottom fifth of income earners is 13% compared to 3.1% for the top 1%, meaning the poorest fifth of Texans pay an effective tax rate nearly 450% higher than the top 1%. Before taxes, the average 1%er in Texas earns 124 times the income of the bottom fifth. After taxes, they earn 140 times more. A predictable outcome when your effective tax rate charges poor people over 4 times more to exist than the top 1%. Not only are these taxes incredibly regressive, but they're also just plain high for the majority of us. Look at how these effective tax rates compare to those in traditional boogeyman states for conservatives like California. The bottom 60% of income earners in Texas pay considerably more in taxes than they do in California. In fact, one would have to be well into the 80th percentile of income earners before they're actually paying substantially lower taxes in Texas. Meaning, if you earn less than about $125,000 a year, you're paying the same or more than you would in California. The free PR of having no income tax seemingly does most of the heavy lifting for these states' reputations as tax havens, for almost none of them actually have low effective tax rates for the majority of us. Among the 9 states that have no personal income tax, the bottom fifth of income earners pay an effective tax rate over 400% higher than the top 1%, compared to the smaller but still poor 39% higher in states with income taxes. Meaning the difference in effective tax rate between the bottom fifth and top 1% is over 10 times higher in states with no income tax. This isn't to call out any one state in particular, since the vast majority of states have a taxation system that exacerbates income inequality as opposed to help alleviating it. In fact, only the District of Columbia and 5 states, New Jersey, Minnesota, Delaware, Vermont, and California, have tax structures that even slightly alleviate income inequality, and even then these states are woefully inadequate in their redistribution. Okay, so even if you were to grant me the point that Texas might actually have higher taxes for the vast majority of us than most states, surely Texas can still happily call itself the small government state without pesky regulations and tyrannical government overreach, right? Again, I just don't see how one can effectively substantiate that claim. Texas is constantly meddling in the affairs of its local governments, and when they actually are adhering to their supposed laissez-faire ideology, it's almost unanimously in a fashion which promotes corporate freedoms while simultaneously eroding those of the average citizen. Take Texas's decades-long experiment with a privatized power grid. According to ProPublica and the Texas Tribune, lawmakers and regulators have repeatedly ignored, dismissed, or watered down efforts to address weaknesses in the state's sprawling electric grid, which is isolated from the rest of the country. This has flared up in two recent crises that are a direct result of this lack of regulation and accountability in Texas's failure to climatize their power grid. Last year, in February, extreme cold weather caused massive power outages throughout Texas, leading to dozens of deaths and nearly a quarter of Texans being without power at its peak. Just months later, in extremely hot weather, ERCOT was urging Texans to conserve energy once again, asking us to set our thermostats at 78 degrees or higher and avoid using larger appliances like ovens, washing machines, and dryers. Whose freedom is being promoted in this situation, and whose is being repressed? Texas Governor Greg Abbott certainly increased ERCOT's liberty as they were allowed to avoid the costly renovations involved in adequately weatherproofing the power grid, yet for the average citizen, we are being burdened by this lack of oversight. This is becoming more apparent in the form of increasingly common severe weather events that not only inconvenience us in restricting our ability to cook and wash clothes, but sometimes even threaten our livelihood as millions of people are left without heat in the dire cold or air conditioning in lethal wet bulb conditions. While this is obviously bad, it's at least technically small government. It would be one thing if Texas was simply and consistently a small government state. While this would certainly result in perverse outcomes surrounding a lack of labor regulations, at least it would also mean broader social freedoms. However, the problem lies in the fact that Texas espouses a preference for a scaled-back government in an incredibly selective manner. Just as they complain about tyrannical overreach from the federal government, they have their hands in all sorts of local Texas affairs and constantly restrict freedom of expression and choice. Texas routinely overrules the autonomy of counties to promote the state's corporate interests. There are almost too many examples to cite. Just recently, they banned local government's ability to ban fracking. In 2018, the Texas Supreme Court struck down Laredo's ban on plastic bags. As reported by the Texas Tribune, it was a loss for local governments, said Bennett Sandlin, executive director of the Texas Municipal League. Plastic bags are the perfect case for why different geographies need different sets of rules, Sandlin said. This is a sad day. This is a perfect example of a long-standing tradition wherein Texas legislatures will feign a preference for localized rule when their state disagrees with contemporary norms, such as with slavery or gay marriage, yet they are the first to impede on local municipalities when they disagree with the will of the state government. Just recently, Abbott announced that he was going to repeal the liquor license of any restaurant in Texas who wishes to, with the autonomy that should be allowed to small business owners in a free state, restrict patrons to only those who are vaccinated in an effort to protect their staff and their community. Before conservatives try some mental gymnastics to work out why this instance of government overreach is fine but others are not, don't. My point is not about any specific instance of the Texas government impeding on local affairs and why that's bad. My point is simply to illustrate the fact that small government is not a coherent, consistent ideology in any sense of the phrase. It is nothing more than an incredibly successful branding exercise on how to get away with corporate robbery by occasionally throwing your constituents a culture war peanut. Not only do they interfere in the affairs of local governments, they also interfere with corporations and churches from time to time. Just last summer, Governor Abbott signed into law Senate Bill 4, which allows the government to pull funding from sports teams that don't play the national anthem before games, in a completely unnecessary centralized overreach and an unconstitutional obstruction of our First Amendment rights and freedom of expression. Similarly, in 2015, the Texas government even urged churches in the state to stop accepting Syrian refugees. Governor Abbott went so far as to send a letter to Barack Obama wherein he informed the president that Texas would no longer be accepting them. This is obviously highly unconstitutional. States have absolutely no authority to deny refugees based on religious or ethnic grounds. If you have legal immigrant status in the U.S. as a refugee, you can travel within the U.S., a free country, freely. If small government, freedom-loving Texas had its way, this would not be the case. Abbott defended this overreach by explaining the government was interfering in local affairs as a means to protect individual freedoms, saying, "We're forming a patchwork quilt of bans and rules and regulations that is eroding the Texas model. That is contrary to my vision for Texas. My vision is one where individual liberties are not bound by city limits. I will insist on protecting unlimited liberty to make sure Texas will continue to grow and prosper." Nice sentiment, Greg. However, is imposing statewide laws that overrule the local governments, who are surely more perceptive of their constituents, really an act of protecting liberty? Of course not. For when Abbott espouses low taxes, freedom, and individual liberties, he's not talking to us. Abbott, like most contemporary elected officials, is nothing more than a vacuous mouthpiece for the interests of Texas big-moneyed interests. He's talking to his donors, not us. Sometimes he can accomplish both at the same time, such as how passing laws that loosen gun regulations adheres to his donors as well as the philosophy of small government. However, most of the time, the laws he passes that loosen regulations do nothing to promote the freedoms of Texans and oftentimes directly suppress them. Another example is our prison population. One of the most contradictory slogans echoed in America is the notion that we are uniquely the land of the free, when we are far and away the most brutally repressive mass incarceration state on earth. The U.S. has the highest rate of incarceration on the planet. There is no contemporary comparison. To find one, we need to go back to some of our favorite historical boogeymen. America today has a similar reported incarceration rate as the Soviet Union did during the height of the infamous Gulag system. And if you expand that list to include Americans in correctional supervision, the number vastly dwarfs the Soviet Union. And within our country, small government, freedom-loving Texas is on the more draconian side of the spectrum, incarcerating about 900 people per 100,000, good for the 8th highest rate in the nation. Texas has a far higher proportion in prison than even China does. And if you may not trust these official Chinese numbers, even if you were to triple their reported prison population and add the already generous estimate leaked by pro-military industrial complex sources of 3 million incarcerated Uyghurs and double that, there would still be a higher proportion of incarcerated Texans than Chinese. And when you break these figures down by race, the troubling inequities of the American system truly begin to emerge. Texas incarcerates 768 white people per 100,000, which is already about 10 times higher than most comparable nations. However, when looking at black Texans, the figure is nearly 3,000 per 100,000. This grotesque figure dwarfs even some of the most repressive caste societies in modern history. Compared to the height of apartheid South Africa, Texas incarcerates its black constituents at nearly 3.5 times the rate of the Afrikaner regime. And while you obviously need to enforce laws and some people must be removed from the general public for the general welfare, we distribute that justice highly unequally, and oftentimes lock people up with little to no basis for its effects on public safety. An article released by Time magazine estimates that 40% of our incarcerated population pose little to no risk for public safety, including nearly 500,000 nonviolent drug offenders. Regardless of what you think about using substances, it goes against the principle of small government, with such tyrannical overreach telling you what you can and can't do with your own body. And not only are we a mass incarceration state like our old nemesis, the Soviet Union, but we're also a forced labor state like our current adversary, China. A 2017 study by the Prison Policy Institute found that prisoners earn between 86 cents to $3.45 a day in jobs that are most often compulsory and with little oversight or regulation. So I must ask, what is uniquely free about a mass incarceration state that utilizes forced labor? A state that mandates patriotism and promotes particular religions? For to make the argument that America is free, conservatives must then reasonably exalt the liberty of the Soviet Union with its proportionally less populated gulags, or praise the racial equity of Afrikaner South Africa, which incarcerated a lower proportion of its black population than we do currently. So what is Texas then? While it's certainly a beautiful state with great food, culture, and scenery, it's not one that can simply be described as having low taxes or a small government. To be as cliched as possible, Texas is an Orwellian land rife with political contradictions. High taxes are low taxes, prison is freedom, no labor protections means more liberty. It intervenes when it shouldn't and doesn't when it should in a way that's often contradictory to the intentions of our founding fathers. Texas is in favor of big government when it comes to favoring certain religions over another, or mandating patriotism in a way that is completely antithetical to our constitutional rights and the foundational principles of this country, yet they are suddenly against big government when it comes to substantially regulating free markets as our founding fathers hoped. Thomas Jefferson warned, "I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare to challenge our government and bid defiance to the laws of our country." Texas, and broadly speaking America, has largely failed in this pursuit, summed up succinctly by Teddy Roosevelt in this quote that still rings true a century later, when he said, There was once a time in history when the limitation of governmental power meant increasing liberty for the people. In the present day, the limitation of government power means the enslavement of the people by the great corporations. Texas is the poster child of a state run by corporations in a country that's the poster child of a nation run by corporations. Texas has low taxes for corporations and billionaires while economically choking the majority of us. Texas is the land of the free when it comes to not requiring environmental protections or labor rights, but constantly overrides local and private affairs to promote a certain religion and forcibly mandate patriotism. Everything truly is bigger in Texas, especially the taxes on the working class and the ideological contradictions. I love Texas, but it's about time the state begins to adhere to its maxim of promoting personal liberties and limiting government overreach by promoting the economic rights of the average Texan and staying out of local affairs.